Good morning, my name's Alec Margolin. I'm here today with Damon Kitney, the Victorian business editor for The Australian. Damon, I understand you recently attended the Global Food Forum hosted by The Australian. What can you tell me about what you've learned from this meeting?
Good to be here, thank you. We do this food forum every year. It's our 6th year of doing it. This year we actually had a record attendance, which I think shows you something about the interest that there is in the agribusiness, ag tech space at the moment. Had a full day event. I think some of the key themes that came out of it, one of the most important is around the financing of this space. There's been copious amounts written and discussed about the lack of investment in agriculture, but particularly from the superannuation space. And I think one of the real landmark things that happened at this forum this year was that we had one of the biggest industry super funds up on the stage, happy to talk about their passion for investment in the space. And this was Host Plus, that was actually one of the best performing super funds over the past 12 months. And their Chief Investment Officer, Sam Cecilia, gave a very passionate view about how much they'd like to be in the space, which is pretty exciting. And he was talking some amazing numbers, like $20 billion potentially to go in from a pool of a number of different industry super funds. It would start with like $2 billion and could build over potentially a decade to $20 billion. So that's a hell of a lot of money and really exciting for the space. The other key theme out of it was for technology across the board in the agribusiness sector, the opportunities, whether that goes on the ground with genetically engineered plants, or the types of new crops that are being manufactured in that space, through to the production process. And that includes things like mechanised harvesters, being able to pick from a bush a strawberry or even a blueberry without having a human hand involved, which is pretty amazing. One of the big fruit and vegetable companies in the country, Costa Group, is doing a lot of trials with a big US company called Driscoll's in this space. And there was quite a lot of talk about that technology aspect as well. And then it goes back to the lab as well in terms of all the developments that are going on there. So yeah, it was a really exciting day for us, and we had a really good roll-up.
Well, it's great to see these industry leaders stepping in and really investing in Australia's backbone. From that same forum, what can you say are the struggles that farmers are facing in today's economy?
Well, I think I've highlighted one already, which is capital. I guess with family farms, as many still are in Australia, there aren't many corporate farms here. Succession has been a big issue. There aren't that many young people that want to go into farming anymore. It's seen as a very difficult occupation. A lot of them would rather go into other areas. But we are seeing, I think, a resurgence in some interest from young people in terms of agribusiness courses that you see at university, and that comes from, I guess, technology coming into the space as well, and more capital coming into it. I think the overall biggest problem, though, for the space is just cost pressures, essentially, coming from, most notably, from gas and energy pricing. That goes from the farm gate all the way through to the supermarkets. You see the pressures all the way along. And it's interesting, at the forum we actually had Rod Sims there, who's the chairman of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, talking about how important it is that that power costs do come down for the space. And the ACCC has been very strong in regulating that space to try to keep a lid on costs. But that continues to be, I guess, one of the greatest challenges for the sector. And the problem is, for a lot of producers, it's a bit out of their hands, really. They just get their bill and they have to cop it.
Well, without completely opening up the door on energy policy, how do you think farmers can beat these energy prices? Is it shifting to them and having their own renewables? or are they still going to have to rely on these baseload coal stations?
Oh, I think it's still out of their hands in a lot of ways because, you know, the conventional power sources are still the way to go. I think what we're seeing is the bigger operators are looking at more alternative sources. I mean, even some manufacturing companies in the food space who do packaging, they are actually, you know, setting up their own solar plants, for example. Now, I mentioned Costa Group earlier, like they're a good example. They do now have their own solar plants that they're building at their mushroom farm, for example, outside Adelaide. So some of these companies are deciding to just take it into their own hands. But, you know, that's a big thing. That's a big company, Costa. It's a multi-billion-dollar group. You need to have the funds to be able to do that. I think for the family farm, it's still very much reliant on traditional, whether it's, you know, off base or whether it's diesel power. So I guess that's why, you know, from the regulators like Rod Sims, it's really important that they are, you know, overseeing the pricing regime to ensure it is competitive.
Completely. Well, given the mining sector is slowing down a little bit, could we see a brighter future or a resurgence for the Australian farming industry?
I think we already are. I think that the statistics that we certainly saw quoted at that forum, and Anthony Pratt, whose Visi Group is the joint venture partner with us at that forum, he quoted some strong stats about export growth for the Australian sort of farm sector over the last 5 years, and it really has improved.
I understand Australia exports 60% of its agricultural products alone, so we really do have a huge opportunity here in the global market.
Totally.
With our farms.
And I think that's the other thing you mentioned at the start about what came out of the forum. We actually had some key players from Southeast Asia and China there on the day. And you've seen some of the successful Australian food companies. I think about one like A2 Milk that a lot of people know about. It's a very retail brand. It's had amazing success in China just by providing a really nicely branded, clean, green product. And they've also been able to migrate not just from fresh milk but into infant formula in China. That's been a huge growth market for them. They're now also looking into America. They're on the West Coast, they're looking at the East Coast. So companies like that, show that you can succeed on the international stage with a quality Australian product in the space.
Yeah, absolutely. Damon, I wanted to touch on quickly generational wealth transfer and how it's playing out here in Australia. From your perspective of ultra high net worth clients we've written about, what are some of their views on this generational transfer of wealth?
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating space. I mean, I've been lucky enough to write about rich people, if I can call it that word, for 20 years now. And it's one of the reasons I like the space as a journalist is it's very hard to crack. As many people would know, you can't get access to these people without having done the yards. And I think about someone like Anthony Pratt, who I write a lot about. It took me 18 months before I could even get an interview with him. And that involved going along to a lot of functions and whatever. So I raised the Pratts because, to answer your question, they're a great example, I think, of how a family has managed to set itself up for the next generation. So when Anthony Pratt's father was in his twilight years, they actually divided up their company between the siblings. So Visi, which is the big paper and packaging and recycling company, that was 100% owned by Richard. What he did was divided it up between his 3 children. So they each had 1/3 of the company. And since Richard's passing, which is quite a few years ago now, they've managed to keep everything together. They've been able to resolve any disputes they've got. The other really important thing Pratt did was, as well as giving them a 1/3 each stake in that company, other parts of the empire basically were divvied up between the children. So Anthony took ownership of the US operations of the group, which is called Pratt Industries. the Geminders, which is one of Richard's daughters and her husband, took control of a company called Pratt Group, which is now listed on the stock exchange and has done very well. And then his other daughter, Eloise, who used to be married to Alex Weislitz. They have Thorney Group, which is a big investment company. So that's a textbook example, I guess, of while everybody's still together and the patriarch is still alive, that they did that division. And so far, it's ensured that there hasn't been any big disputes in the Pratt family. Even the separation of Eloise and Alex has been quite smooth, really. When you think about some other families where there are divorces, it's really difficult. But they've just gone along because they have that business and they sort that out. Eloise has her stake in Visi, she keeps going. So it's just a great example of how you can do it well. I've certainly seen other situations where it's gone very poorly, and I think one of the real challenges for the patriarchs, like the Richard Pratts, is that they find it very hard to give up control, to be able to defer to the next generation. They really want to retain that sort of day-to-day management control of the company. And what that does is, for the next generation who have ambition or whatever they want to do, they tend not to get the opportunities that they really need and want. And that leads to tensions amongst family boards, that leads to tensions inside families. And sometimes what you see is when the patriarch dies, there's terrible fights that happen, sometimes spill into the courts between the siblings to get their share of the fortune or to get their share of the company because they've never had that opportunity. So I think what you're finding with a lot of the high net worth advisory groups, and there's plenty of them out there, big and small, is the common refrain amongst them is to really have a good succession plan, to have a good company constitution, to have empowerment of the next generation, to not leave it all in the hands of the patriarch, and to have him still sitting at it's usually him, sometimes it's her, but usually him sitting at the top of the table, divvying out who gets what. That tends to be a model that fails. And unfortunately, as I said, we've seen some terrible things in the Australian courts over this. One that comes to mind that everybody knows is the Reinhardt family. I mean, that's been terribly, antagonistic between.
Not to mention highly publicised.
That's right. Yeah, but everybody loves a Reinhardt story, as they say.
Obviously, the issue of taxation of this wealth is a pretty polarising topic. What issues can you see with higher taxation of the wealth as it goes from father to son or to daughter?
Look, I think it's a challenge for the space. I think there's a general, it sort of goes into a public debate at the moment, I guess a backlash against wealth, whether that's in the form of corporate wealth or private wealth. There's a view from the general populace that, they're not getting as much of a benefit as what some of these wealthy people are. And I think there's no doubt, I think it's been shown in some of the public revelations in the last few years and the use of tax havens that some haven't, done the right thing, which is not unexpected and disappointing. But I think overall, what we need to remember is when it comes to taxation of this space, a lot of these, particularly the private, family-run businesses are people that have come from abroad. A lot of them were migrants. They've started businesses here from scratch, and they have held those businesses through successive generations, and they have employed a hell of a lot of Australian people in the process. And by and large, most of them have tried to do the right thing in terms of their obligations. I think, there is a stigma at the moment about this part of society that I think they find quite hard to shake, and I think there is an unfair aspect to that as well. I think where people are found to have unfairly used tax havens or broken the law, they should be held to account to the ultimate degree. But I think we need to remember how much wealth has been created by particularly the private family space in Australia.
Speaking of family businesses, I understand you are writing the biography for James Packer at the moment. Can you tell me a little bit about how that came apart?
Yeah, sure. It's not actually sort of for him. It's an independent thing, which is good. It's not something he commissioned. It was sort of by chance. I was asked by a publisher to write his biography after a big interview I did with him at the end of last year. It was the first real interview that he'd given for a number of years on some pretty controversial topics, including his relationship with Mariah Carey and including the arrest of his staff in China in 2016, which was quite devastating. And also to the topic we've just been talking about, he talked for the first time about the division of the family fortune with his sister, which ended up being quite bitter, which again is very sad, but they didn't go to the courts, which is good. But yeah, it's been an interesting process so far. It's still sort of working through it. I think the most interesting thing from my perspective and from the public's perspective is Mr. Packer's revelation a month ago about his mental health battle. I think that was a gutsy call from him to come out and publicly acknowledge that. I think for people like myself and a lot of others that have followed his story for a long time, and I've been following it now for 20 years, I think that revelation gave a lot of context to things in his life. Not an excuse for what he's done or his mistakes or for bad behaviour, but I think just a context that explains that he has been battling some really bad private demons for a long time. As I wrote in the paper a month ago, he's had 3 nervous breakdowns in his life. The latest one, just over the past 2 years. So it's been an absolute roller coaster ride for him. And I think for the first time, he acknowledged to the public that, hey, I have been battling with my mental health situation, not just, looking like an idiot for some of the things that I've done over time. So yeah, it's been an interesting process. It's still got a way to run, but yeah, hopefully it'll tell a good story.
Yeah. Well, it's been really great to see Packer come out about his mental health issue for his own well-being and for others as well. I can see that given the public space at the moment, there's a good conversation going on about mental health. Have you seen any other mental health touchings in any of your other clients or any of your writings in the past?
It's a good question. I think, and you've hit the nail on the head, I think we're in a different context now than what we were in the past, where people can talk about these things. I think I've found with a few interviews in recent years that people have been more willing to at least talk about their personal battles. Mental health is a very serious sort of aspect that few, I think, are still going to publicly acknowledge. But I think, quite a few of the people I've spoken to seem more prepared to open up about, how difficult it's been managing that, if you can call it stigma of wealth, I guess. It's a big responsibility to inherit $1 billion. I know that sounds flippant, but yeah, and I think a lot of people don't appreciate what comes with that. And also with a lot of these people, Packer's a great example, but there's many others. I mentioned Pratt earlier. Their fathers were really, they were once in a generation type characters, but they were incredibly tough. And they bullied their children. That was the way that they were brought up. That was the way they brought up their own children. And that carries significant consequences for the next generations. And I think what we're seeing now, which is it's touching really, one of the things I have had a very lucky opportunity with Packer is to just see him with his children in that context. And he's has learnt the lessons from his own childhood about the best way to bring up your children. It's the same with Anthony Pratt, to use him as another example. I mean, he has learnt from the way his father treated him and the way not to treat his own children. So it's back to your question, we're in a totally different world now. Things like mental health, time for parenting, it's all acceptable now. Whereas in the generations of those older patriarchs, this stuff was just not talked about ever.
Returning to your writing, I'm kind of curious to know, when you're writing this biography, where do you sit? What do you do? Do you go down to the typical Fitzroy cafe and grab a latte and begin your work, or?
No, I must say, so far I've just been working pretty much at home. I've got school-age children, so I do luckily get sort of 9 till 4 to do it. I have actually spent a week away. A friend kindly lent me their beach house where I spent a week, and I'm going to do that for another 10 days in a few weeks' time. I think that's really good because it just allows you to have no distractions whatsoever, and you can sort of work from the moment you get up in the morning to the moment you go to bed at night, and really focus on it. I mean, one thing I guess about being a day-to-day journalist for 20 years, which is really, really lucky, is I can write quite quickly, and that's been driven into me over many years. Some days, I'd have to turn around 5,000 words of copy for the newspaper. So that's one blessing in this process, that I've sort of been conditioned to write quite quickly. So
Absolutely. Well, your book comes out later this year, I believe.
That's right.
I'm sure we're all eagerly awaiting that. I'd like to thank you for coming down today, Damon Kitney, and thank you for coming down to Australian Standfirst, and we wish you all the best.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.